I didn't realize the neighborhood had gone completely silent until I saw three men in bright orange survey vests planting stakes along the HOA's entrance wall. The same wall the board had bragged about at every community meeting, and the funniest part was that none of them were looking at my fence anymore. A week earlier, they couldn't stop talking about my fence, threatening me with fines, deadlines, and legal action, acting like 6 cedar panels I'd built with my own hands were somehow the greatest threat this subdivision had ever faced. But now every pair of eyes was fixed on that brick monument at the front entrance, and the president of the HOA, a man named Victor Langley, looked like someone had just told him his house was on fire. If you've ever had people with too much authority and too little humility come after you, then you'll probably understand why I didn't say a single word that morning. I just stood there with a cup of coffee, watched the survey crew do their job, and remembered exactly how this whole mess had started. My name's Ethan Mercer, and about a year before all this happened, my wife Claire and I decided we were done with city life. We'd spent nearly 20 years raising 2 daughters in Columbus, and once they both left for college, we wanted something quieter, somewhere with sidewalks, trees, neighbors who waved instead of honked, and enough backyard space for me to build the cedar fence I'd always wanted. The subdivision looked perfect. The homes were clean, people kept their lawns trimmed, kids rode bikes in the evenings, and even though there was an HOA, everyone we talked to described it as pretty relaxed. Looking back now, I realized those words should have come with quotation marks. I wasn't exactly worried about the HOA because paperwork had never scared me. I believed that if you followed the rules, documented everything, and treated people with respect, they'd do the same. That's probably the most naive thing I'll admit in this story. About 3 months after moving in, I started planning the fence. Nothing extravagant, just 6 cedar privacy panels running along the rear side boundary, where our yard met a strip of common landscaping. Before I bought a single board, I visited the county permit office, downloaded the assessor's parcel map, reviewed the subdivision plat available through the recorder's office, and even called the utility locating service before digging the post holes. The clerk at the county laughed when I apologized for asking so many questions. She smiled and said, "Honestly, I wish more homeowners were like you." That stuck with me. I spent 2 weekends building that fence. My neighbor on the left, Frank Delaney, wandered over with 2 folding chairs and a cooler full of iced tea just to keep me company while I worked. Every now and then he'd joke that I measured more than I hammered, and honestly he wasn't wrong. I checked every post twice, every panel 3 times, because that's just how my brain works. When it was finished, it looked exactly the way Claire and I had imagined it. Straight lines, warm cedar grain catching the evening sun, enough privacy to enjoy our backyard without feeling boxed in. Even a few neighbors stopped during their evening walks to compliment it. One woman told me it looked like it belonged in a home magazine. I figured that was the end of the project. 3 weeks later, I opened my mailbox and found a certified envelope with the HOA logo stamped across the front. At first, I assumed it was some welcome packet I'd missed. Instead, inside was a violation notice stating that my fence had been constructed on association property and had to be removed by Friday, or I would be fined $150 per day until it was gone. I actually laughed the first time I read it, because I thought they had mixed me up with someone else. Then I read my address again, and my name, and suddenly it wasn't funny anymore. Claire watched my face change while I stood in the kitchen holding that letter. She asked, "What's wrong?" I handed it to her without saying anything. She read it once, then again, then looked back at me and quietly said, "But you checked everything." "I know," I answered. "That's why this doesn't make any sense." The next morning, I called the property management office expecting someone to tell me there had been a clerical mistake. Instead, I got transferred 3 times before a woman finally informed me, in the kind of rehearsed customer service voice that somehow sounded colder than yelling, that the board had already determined my fence extended onto HOA common property and the violation would remain unless I voluntarily removed it. I asked what documents they used to reach that conclusion. She replied, "Our records indicate the fence is not compliant." I asked if I could see those records. She paused just long enough to make it obvious she wasn't planning to answer, then simply repeated, "You'll need to attend the compliance hearing if you wish to dispute the violation." That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. Somebody had already decided I was wrong. They just hadn't bothered proving it. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and as I organized my permit, my deed, copies of the recorded plat, assessor maps, construction photos, and every receipt connected to the fence, I still believed facts would solve the problem. I had no idea I was about to walk into a room where facts mattered a whole lot less than someone's ego, and by the time that meeting ended, everything I thought I knew about this neighborhood was going to change. The meeting took place inside the clubhouse on a Tuesday evening, one of those rooms that tried very hard to look official with framed community awards, matching leather chairs, and a giant American flag standing in the corner. But the atmosphere felt less like a neighborhood discussion and more like a courtroom where somebody had already decided the verdict before I walked through the door. Victor Langley sat at the center of the table with the confidence of a man who had spent years telling people what they could and couldn't do with their own property. Beside him sat the property manager, Denise Porter, her laptop already open, while two other board members barely looked up from their paperwork. I introduced myself, thanked everyone for their time, and laid my documents neatly across the table. "I'd just like to show everyone how I determined the property line," I said. Victor didn't even glance down. He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and replied, "Mr. Mercer, we've already reviewed this matter." I smiled politely. "Actually, I don't think you have, because if you compare the recorded subdivision plat with the assessor's parcel map, you'll see the fence sits exactly on my boundary." Denise slid one sheet of paper toward Victor. He pushed it back without reading it. Then he looked straight at me and said something I'll never forget. "County paperwork doesn't override the records maintained by this association." For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd misheard him. "Excuse me?" I asked. He repeated it even slower. "Take the fence down before Friday, or the daily fines begin." I tried one last time. "Can I at least see the survey or legal description you're relying on?" Denise answered instead. "Our property files are not subject to homeowner inspection." That statement alone told me everything I needed to know. There wasn't going to be a discussion because there had never been an investigation. The board had simply accepted whatever someone had entered into their internal files years ago and declared it to be reality. I gathered my paperwork, thanked them anyway, and started walking toward the door when Denise casually added, "You'll also notice a $300 enforcement administration fee has been added to your account effective immediately." I stopped halfway to the exit. "For what?" Victor answered without looking up. "For processing the violation." I couldn't help laughing, not because anything was funny, but because my brain didn't know what else to do. They had charged me $300 for accusing me of something they hadn't proven. Frank was waiting outside in the parking lot because he'd insisted on driving over in case I needed someone to vent to afterward. The moment I climbed into his truck, he took one look at my face and asked, "That bad?" I nodded. "Worse." We sat there for several minutes without saying much. Finally, he asked, "So what are you going to do?" I stared out through the windshield at the clubhouse lights and quietly answered, "I'm going to find out why they're so confident." Claire was still awake when I got home. She had made coffee even though it was nearly 9 o'clock because she knew I wasn't going to sleep anytime soon. She listened while I described everything that had happened, every dismissive comment, every smug smile, every sentence that suggested the outcome had been decided long before I entered the room. When I finished, she didn't immediately start talking. Instead, she walked over to the hallway closet, reached onto the top shelf, and pulled down an old gray storage box I'd packed years earlier after leaving county government. She sat on the kitchen table without saying a word. Inside were field notebooks, surveying references, old boundary law manuals, calibration certificates, and tucked neatly inside a protective folder, my professional land surveyor license. I hadn't looked at that license in years. I ran my thumb across the plastic card and smiled to myself. Before moving into private consulting for engineering projects, I'd spent almost a decade working for the county engineering department, resolving boundary disputes, recovering lost monuments, reviewing subdivision plats, and testifying in property line disagreements. Even after changing careers, I kept my certification active because once you've spent that many years learning how land records fit together, it's hard to walk away completely. Claire leaned against the counter and quietly asked, "Do you think they're wrong?" I looked at the violation notice lying beside the license. I don't know yet, I answered honestly, but tomorrow I'm going to stop assuming they're right. The next morning, I drove to the county records office before it even opened. Some of the employees still recognized me, which made me laugh because apparently surveyors never really disappear. Margaret, one of the senior clerks, smiled the moment she saw me. Ethan Mercer, haven't seen you in forever. What brings you back? I slid my subdivision information across the counter. I need every recorded document connected to Brookstone Estates, especially the original developer filings. She raised one eyebrow. Sounds like somebody's having boundary problems. You could say that. Over the next several hours, I gathered copies of the original subdivision plat filed in 1988. The amended dedication documents recorded the following year, easement revisions, utility maps, assessor overlays, historical aerial photography, tax parcel descriptions, and every legal description tied to my lot and the neighboring common area. Back home, my dining room slowly disappeared beneath stacks of paper. Claire joked that the room looked less like a house and more like a law office preparing for trial. I wasn't looking for a loophole. I was looking for consistency. Good surveying isn't about proving yourself right. It's about letting independent evidence point everyone toward the same answer. So I built what we use to call a control chain. First, the recorded plat, then the deed descriptions, then county GIS, then historical monument locations, then aerial imagery. Every source became another piece of the same puzzle. By late afternoon, something began bothering me. It wasn't my fence. Every document I checked continued placing my fence where I'd expected it to be. The measurements lined up almost perfectly. Instead, my eyes kept drifting toward another feature entirely, the decorative brick entrance wall standing beside the subdivision sign. At first I assumed I was imagining things because the difference looked too small to matter, but the legal descriptions kept pointing to the same location. I enlarged the plat. Then I overlaid the GIS boundary. Then I pulled an old engineering coordinate file I'd almost forgotten existed. The alignment didn't match the wall. I leaned back in my chair and whispered, "No." Claire looked over from the living room. "What?" I didn't answer immediately because I wasn't ready to believe what I was seeing. Instead, I grabbed another set of measurements and started over from the beginning, ignoring every previous calculation. Same result. I checked monument references. Same result. I recalculated bearing calls manually instead of relying on software. Same result again. My pulse actually sped up because surveyors don't get excited very often, but when independent evidence keeps producing the exact same answer over and over, you learn to pay attention. The HOA wasn't protecting common property from my fence. If these records were accurate, the association's own entrance wall appeared to cross beyond the platted boundary. Not by several feet, not by some outrageous amount, but by enough that it legally mattered. 14 inches. 14 inches sitting on land that the original developer had deeded to adjacent homeowners decades earlier. I stared at the screen for several long seconds before quietly saying the only words that came to mind. "You've got to be kidding me." But experience had taught me something just as important as patience. Never accuse anyone based on paperwork alone. Documents tell a story, but field evidence finishes it. If I was going to challenge an HOA that had already decided I was wrong, I needed proof no reasonable person could ignore. That meant pulling the survey equipment out of storage, locating the original control monuments, verifying every coordinate on the ground, and measuring that entrance wall the same way I'd measured hundreds of disputed boundaries throughout my career. At that point, this wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about my fence. It had become something much bigger, because if my calculations were correct, the board had spent years threatening homeowners over property lines while never realizing their own landmark structure might be the one sitting where it never legally belonged. The following Saturday, the neighborhood was still quiet when I unlocked the storage trailer behind my garage and pulled out equipment I hadn't touched in years. My total station had been professionally calibrated only months earlier because I occasionally helped an engineering friend with consulting work. My GPS receiver still held a valid RTK subscription, and after all those years in county surveying, setting up a control point felt as natural as riding a bicycle. Frank wandered over carrying 2 cups of coffee, looked at the tripod, then looked at me and grinned. I guess we're way past arguing with the HOA now. I laughed. Yeah, now we're just measuring. We spent the morning recovering the original monument markers referenced on the recorded subdivision plat. Every iron pin we located matched the county records almost perfectly. By noon, I had established enough verified control points to shoot the entire entrance corridor. The numbers appeared on the data collector exactly the way I'd feared they would. I checked them again, then again. Finally, I exported the coordinate file and overlaid it onto the recorded plat. There was in black and white. The decorative brick wall wasn't sitting inside the HOA common area at all. It crossed the platted property line by approximately 14 inches along a significant portion of its length. 14 inches doesn't sound like much until you understand property law. A few inches can determine ownership, liability, maintenance responsibility, insurance exposure, and the outcome of a lawsuit. I didn't celebrate. Honestly, I just sat in my truck for a while staring at the results. I kept thinking about how easily this entire situation could have been avoided if someone on that board had simply looked at my paperwork instead of assuming they were automatically right. Over the next several days, I prepared a formal boundary report exactly the way I had done for county disputes years earlier. Every exhibit was labeled. Every photograph was referenced. Every coordinate included its supporting documentation. I attached copies of the recorded plats, deed descriptions, GIS overlays, monument recovery notes, GPS observations, and a written explanation describing how the measurements had been verified independently. Then I submitted the complete package to the County Land Records Office requesting a title discrepancy review, and I mailed certified copies to the HOA's attorney. Not the board, not the property manager, their attorney. That decision changed everything. About 3 weeks later, I received confirmation that the county had opened a formal review. 2 days after that, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the law firm representing the association. The attorney introduced himself politely and asked whether I would be available to discuss my report. Unlike the board, he had clearly read every page. He asked thoughtful questions about monument recovery, control verification, and historical dedication documents. At the end of the conversation, he paused before saying something that told me exactly how serious the situation had become. Mr. Mercer, based on what we've reviewed so far, your findings appear to be supported by the recorded documents. I thanked him for his professionalism and hung up. Less than 48 hours later, Victor Langley called me personally. Gone was the confident tone from the hearing. Gone were the lectures about HOA authority. Instead, he sounded tired, almost nervous. Ethan, I think there may have been some misunderstandings. I looked out toward my backyard where my cedar fence still stood exactly where I'd built it. Really? I asked. There was a long silence before he continued. The board would like to resolve this without further conflict. I answered as calmly as I could. That's fine with me. Put everything in writing. A special board meeting was held the following week. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, residents packed the clubhouse. Nobody officially announced why, but rumors travel faster than email in neighborhoods like ours. The board voted unanimously to withdraw the violation against my fence. They eliminated every pending fine, refunded the $300 enforcement fee, and entered into the official meeting minutes that my fence fully complied with applicable requirements. What they didn't do was explain why. They never admitted the original accusation had been baseless. They never apologized, but they didn't need to. The paperwork spoke loudly enough on its own. A few mornings later, I happened to be watering flowers near the front of the subdivision when several county survey vehicles pulled up beside the entrance wall. Orange vests climbed out, tripods unfolded, prisms appeared, and within minutes red marking flags stretched along the same brick wall the HOA had proudly displayed for more than 30 years. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks pretending not to watch while watching every single move. Victor stood near the clubhouse entrance, speaking rapidly into his phone. Denise kept pacing between the survey crew and the parking lot. Nobody looked at my fence anymore. Not one person. For weeks, the only thing anyone had wanted to discuss was whether 6 cedar fence panels belonged on my property. Now the entire neighborhood was asking a different question. How had the HOA spent decades enforcing rules about property boundaries without ever verifying the location of its own landmark? I don't know what final resolution the county eventually reached regarding that wall, because, believe it or not, by then I had stopped caring. My goal had never been to force demolition or embarrass anyone publicly. I simply wanted the same fairness the board expected from every homeowner. If they were going to demand evidence from residents, they needed to respect evidence themselves. Today my fence is still standing exactly where I built it. Every time I stain the cedar or replace a loose screw, I smile a little because it reminds me that standing your ground doesn't always require raising your voice. Sometimes it just requires knowing your facts better than the person trying to intimidate. Looking back, I think the biggest mistake the board made wasn't sending me the violation notice. It was assuming paperwork could be used as a weapon against someone who understood exactly how paperwork was supposed to work. So now I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, would you have stopped after getting the fines removed? Or would you have pushed even harder once you discovered the HOA's own wall was over the property line? Let me know down in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between protecting your rights and proving a point. And if you've ever had an HOA, a government office, or anyone else try to bury you under paperwork without expecting you to check the fact for yourself, share your story below. I'd love to read it, because sometimes the smallest line on a survey map ends up exposing the biggest mistake of all.